The fires came first. They always do in a hive. Before the roar, before the iron rhythm of boots on grating, before the bellowing that orcs call a war cry, there is fire. It had already swallowed sublevel 19 when the alert reached the command station, had already licked its way through hab corridors and supply routes and the rusted bones of infrastructure that nobody had repaired in 60 years, because nobody had ever been asked to. Hive Salanthas burned tonight not because of some great conspiracy of the ruinous powers, not because an arch heretic had opened a ritual and invited ruin through a tear in the veil. It burned because something had been waiting too long in the dark, and patience, even orcish patience, has its limit. The splinter force numbered 800. It had carved through the lower intake vents over 3 days, moving in slow and grinding silence the way a drill bit moves through steel, methodically, patiently, until the pressure found the hollow space behind the metal and the whole thing gave way. The Imperial Guard 42nd Sublevel Garrison had been stationed here for 7 months without meaningful reinforcement. 3 platoons. Good soldiers, all of them, trained and believing in holding the line with the particular quiet dignity of people who know that nobody is coming to help but who stand anyway, because that is what you do. But 3 platoons against 800 orcs in a corridor system built for industrial maintenance and not for war is not a battle. It is an equation, and the equation resolves in one direction only. The first platoon broke at the second barricade. The second collapsed at the transit junction. The third scattered into the maintenance tunnels, and some of them would find their way out and some of them would not. The corridor of Subdistrict 14 Tertius was open. 600 meters long, that corridor, wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast. Along its eastern wall, near the midpoint where the lighting had been dead for years, a civilian creche had taken shelter. 40, perhaps 60 souls, the accounts vary. They were led by a shrine school lector who had already exhausted the charge in his lost pistol, and had now placed himself at the front of his flock with arms extended, as though his body might serve as a wall. Among those he sheltered were children. Young ones. The kind of young that has no business inside an equation like this one. Space Marine Captain Aldrich Vane of the Iron Striders chapter arrived at the corridor's northern entrance with a squad of 7. They had been 3 levels above, managing a secondary breach, when the guard communication frequencies dissolved into static and screaming. Vane rerouted without ceremony. He moved fast, with the specific economy of motion that separates a starts from men, each step purposeful. Each adjustment of weight measured in the mathematics of battlefield physics that had been carved into him over a century of war. He did not panic. He assessed. 30 meters ahead of him was the orc warband, still in momentum. 200 meters beyond them were the civilians. 7 Astartes stood behind him. He understood the arithmetic immediately. His squad opened fire without command because they understood it too, and the corridor filled with bolter fire and the roar of something ancient and green and delighted. Because orcs laugh when you shoot them. They laugh because this is the thing they came for. The first orc fell. More filled the space behind it. The mathematics did not change. The children were still 200 meters away. The corridor filled with smoke. The lights at the far end were already dying. And for the first time in longer than he could clearly recall, Aldrich Vane was going to be late. It came from the smoke, not from the orc side. Not from behind Vane's position. From the corridor wall, from the shadows pooled against the eastern infrastructure alcoves where the pipes ran thick and the dark had settled like sediment over decades of neglect. It did not announce itself. It did not call out. It simply separated itself from the darkness the way a storm separates from the horizon, gradually, and then all at once, and you realize the shape was always there, waiting for the light to find it. Big Daddy was enormous in the corridor. Not merely tall, but enormous. In the way that certain things are enormous not just because of their size, but because of the absolute certainty they carry into a space. The bulk of the deep suit filled the passage like something architectural, something that belonged to the structure itself, as though the corridor had always been shaped to accommodate this presence, and only now was revealing what it had been built for all along. The amber light of the porthole helmet glowed dull and steady through the smoke. The drill arm, rotating even now at low idle, the way a predator flexes its hands not from aggression but from the simple habit of being what it is, caught the firelight and scattered it in slow arcs across the grating. He did not turn toward Vane. He did not turn toward the Marines at all. He placed himself between the orcs and the civilians, and he stopped moving. That was the entirety of his communication. He stopped, and he stood, and in standing he became something the corridor had not possessed a moment before. An answer, not a complicated one, not an ideological one. A physical answer to a physical problem. The children were behind him, and anything that wanted to reach them would have to go through something that did not bleed the way things were supposed to bleed. The lead orc saw him first. There was a momentary disruption in the warband's momentum, a hiccup in the bellowing, a half-second where even orcish cognition paused to process what it was looking at. And then the pause ended, because orcs do not process novelty as a reason to stop. They process it as a reason to accelerate. The warband surged forward with a different pitch now, not the simple roar of an unopposed advance, but something closer to delight, the sound of creatures who have found something worth the effort. The drill engaged, not the slow idle of moments before. Full speed, the kind of speed that turns metal to vapor, that eats through armored hulls built to absorb cannon fire. The sound it made was its own language, low and grinding and absolute, and it resonated through the grating beneath Vane's boots and up through his armor and into the bones that were still close enough to human to receive vibration as something more than data. The first orc reached the Guardian and the drill answered it, and what the drill said was final and not up for debate. He held the corridor. Understand what that means in physical terms. 600 meters compressed to the width of 4 men walking abreast. An orc warband pushing from one end. One being standing at the other end of that push, and the being did not move. It absorbed. It turned. It used the narrowness of the passage the way a craftsman uses a vise. As a tool, as an advantage, as the reason the thing being worked cannot escape the working. Orc that entered killing range met the same answer. The same drill. The same amber-lit presence that did not rage, did not celebrate, did not pause to assess whether this was going well or badly. It simply continued, the way a machine continues, because stopping is not in the design. Vane watched from 30 meters back. His squad had stopped firing. Not from any order. From the kind of involuntary suspension that happens when you witness something that exceeds the categories you carry. 7 warriors with hundreds of years of combined battlefield experience. Men who had faced tyrannid swarms and chaos warbands and the cold geometries of Necron incursions, and not one of them spoke. Not because they were afraid, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more completely. Vane studied the being in the corridor, the deliberate placement of the body, the way the drill was applied precisely as though each motion had been calculated in advance. He studied the angle of its attention, which never wavered toward the Marines, not once. Not even as the orcs began to thin and the immediate pressure of the warband started to collapse under the arithmetic of sustained losses against an obstacle that did not tire. Not chaos, not corruption, not the madness of a xenos predator running on instinct. He was watching something protect. The last orcs broke and fled, which orcs almost never do. They retreated into the maintenance tunnels from which they had come, carrying their dead and their wounded and the particular shame of creatures who expected to be unopposed and found, instead, a wall. Big Daddy watched them go. The drill slowed. The amber light held steady. He turned then not toward Vane but toward the civilians. Toward the lector whose arms had dropped to his sides and whose mouth was open with no words inside it. Toward the children pressed against the corridor wall with expressions that did not contain only fear. Expressions in which something else had been let in. Something without a name yet that would eventually find one. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he turned away. Vane had not moved. His squad had not moved. The being did not acknowledge them, or if it did not show it. And that was perhaps the strangest thing of all. That something capable of what he had just witnessed did not seem to need to be acknowledged in return. The surveillance relay in Subdistrict 14 Tertius was a 12-year-old system, partially blinded by mineral buildup on the sensor lenses, and partially obstructed by infrastructure that had grown over and around it in the decades since installation, but it was still running, which meant it had recorded everything. Vane knew this before he returned to the command station. He knew it the way you know the location of a problem before you open the door, not because you have been inside yet, but because you understand the architecture well enough to know what is waiting on the other side of it. He sat in front of the relay terminal alone. He had dismissed his squad with word that there were perimeter checks to conduct, which was true and was also, in the specific tone of his delivery, a clear signal that he needed the room empty. They went without question. That was the advantage of serving with the same men for 30 years. Certain silences communicated more precisely than language ever could. The footage was clear. That was the first thing that struck him. Given the age of the system, given the smoke in the corridor and the failing lights, the footage was clearer than it had any right to be. The amber glow of the porthole had apparently been sufficient. The footage showed the entity's arrival from the alcove. It showed the placement of the body. It showed what the drill had done and how the corridor had been held and how the orcs had finally broken. It showed, with a precision that felt almost deliberate, the moment the being had turned toward the civilians and the children, and the quality of attention in that turn, which was not the attention of a predator surveying prey, and not the attention of a soldier assessing a secured position. It was something quieter and stranger and more careful than either of those things. Vane watched the footage 3 times. Protocol was unambiguous. An unknown xenos entity operating in an Imperial hive, regardless of action and regardless of context, was a Category 1 threat disclosure. The record went to Sector Command, to Chapter Oversight, to Inquisitorial Review within 48 hours. This rule did not exist because someone had carefully considered the full range of possible xenos behaviors and decided all of them warranted the same response. It existed because the Imperium had learned, over 10,000 years of catastrophic mistakes, that exceptions were the crack in the wall that eventually brought the wall down. The rule was not a judgment. It was a scar. Vane understood this. He had enforced this kind of protocol himself more than once, had delivered reports that led to the deaths of things that were not, by any honest reading of the evidence, hostile. Had done it without ceremony and without regret, because the protocol was never about the individual case. It was about the architecture of survival for a species that cannot afford nuance at scale. He understood all of this. He watched the footage one more time. Then he pulled up the report template and began to type. He typed carefully, in the deliberate way of someone making a decision inside the act of typing and who will not revisit it once the hands stop moving. He wrote that the corridor engagement had been severe, that the orc warband had been neutralized, that civilian casualties were minimal, that a contributing factor had been a structural detonation in the eastern alcove, cause unknown, industrial origin likely, that the defense corridor had been stabilized by squad action. He typed it clean and he typed it complete, and it did not mention the amber porthole, and it did not mention the drill, and it did not mention what he had watched hold the line alone for 7 minutes against 800 orcs. He submitted the report. Then he flagged the surveillance relay log as corrupted, noting a sensor malfunction consistent with the relay's documented service record, and deleted the footage. He did not hesitate at any of these steps. He did not breathe differently. He did not sit afterward in the terminal chair wrestling with himself or feeling the weight of a moral reckoning arriving in his chest. He simply did what he had decided, then stood, walked to the door, and paused there for just a moment with his hand on the frame. Not from guilt, not from doubt, from something that required neither name nor resolution. Then he walked through. He did not justify it to himself. There was nothing to justify. He had seen what he had seen, and the report reflected what the report reflected, and those two things were now separate from each other and would remain so. That was the choice. Simple, irrevocable, and made in silence. Inquisitor Vale. Thorn had a method. Most people who spent time in his company eventually noticed it, usually a little too late to be comfortable with the noticing. He did not search for the thing he was looking for. He searched for the shape of the space where the thing was not, and then he filled that shape in from inference and from the pressure of his patience. And patience was perhaps the most genuinely dangerous thing about Vale Thorn, more dangerous than his rosette, more dangerous than the specific and quietly technical knowledge he possessed about the ways a human body could be made to cooperate with an interrogation. He could wait the way geology waits, without awareness of waiting, without frustration, without the fidgeting anxiety that makes lesser investigators cut corners. He simply accumulated. He had been accumulating for 11 days when he sat down with the combat logs from Subdistrict 14 Tertius. The orc incursion reports were unremarkable on the surface. Every hive world in the sector had handled some version of this in the past year. A splinter warband emerging from the infrastructure, a defense response, casualties managed to acceptable levels. The Iron Strider's involvement was noted, as it always was when Astartes operated in civilian zones, because any deviation from standard guard response became a data point worth keeping. This was not suspicion. This was method. The logs came in and Thorn read them the way a geologist reads strata, not looking for the rock itself, but for the gap in the rock, the missing layer, the place where the record skips. The first thing he found was the camera record, or rather the thing that was supposed to be the camera record. A relay system in Subdistrict 14 Tertius had logged a malfunction at 0217 local time. Mineral buildup on the sensor lenses, consistent with the facility's maintenance record, plausibly unremarkable on its own. But the malfunction timestamp corresponded exactly to the window in which the orc warband had been engaged and neutralized in that specific corridor. Not approximately, not within a reasonable range. Thorn noted this and continued. The second anomaly was more subtle. Power fluctuation reports from the sub-district grid showed a draw pattern that did not match the Astartes squad's equipment signatures. The Iron Striders chapter used standard pattern bolt weapons and power armor with a documented energy profile. And Thorn knew this because he had made a point of knowing the power profiles of every chapter that operated in his jurisdiction. This was the kind of tedious and unglamorous knowledge that separated Inquisitors who retired from Inquisitors who did not. The draw pattern in Corridor 14 Tertius during the engagement window showed a secondary signature. Sustained rotational mechanism, approximately 3 seconds at peak, cycling. Mechanical, not a bolter, not a plasma coil or a melt-a-charge. He noted this. The third thing was Captain Aldrich Vane himself. Thorn had not yet interacted with Vane directly, but he had read the service record, which was long and clean and consistent. The record of a man who had processed 600 years of war without a single disciplinary notation, without a single report that a senior reviewer had later flagged for omission. A very clean record. The kind of clean that is not suspicious on its own because most Astartes of that tenure have clean records. But a very clean record submitted immediately after an engagement in which the surveillance system had malfunctioned at the precise moment of maximum tactical significance. That specific juxtaposition had a shape. Thorn traced the shape for a long time. What he arrived at was not a conclusion. It was a change in the nature of the question itself. Until now, the pattern he had been quietly assembling, the symbol spreading through the lower hive, the civilians who would not speak against the entity, the complete absence of any hostile incident connected to the being, had been a question about a xenos interloper and a population it had infected with seditious attachment. That was containable. Civilian networks were organic and slow-moving and could be pruned. But if an Astartes captain had falsified a report to protect this entity, that was no longer a question about a xenos interloper. That was a question about the loyalty architecture of the Imperium itself. Civilians loved things they were not supposed to love. That was as old as the species. But Astartes were not supposed to be vulnerable to the kind of emotional gravity that pulled ordinary people off course. If the being in the helmet could exert that kind of pull on a century-trained warrior of the Emperor's own making, then everything Thorn had been measuring was smaller than what was actually happening. He opened a new file. He labeled it simply Iron Strider's Discretionary Audit. He did not rush. Children do not keep records. They do not understand classification levels or report formats or the institutional machinery by which information is authorized or suppressed. What they have instead is simpler, and in its simplicity more durable. They have mouths and they have the social instinct of their species, which compels them to share experience with other small people who can receive it without the adult mechanism of immediate skepticism, the reflex that hears something strange and says that cannot be true before the story has finished arriving. The children from the Shrine School creche talk to each other first. In the dormitory on the relocation level, in the 3 days following the corridor incident, during the intervals between prayers and ration distributions, and the psychological assessments conducted by a junior medici who was too overworked to be thorough, they talked. They talked in the specific concentrated whisper of young people who have witnessed something the adults around them are clearly not discussing and have therefore identified it as information that belongs to them, a private thing, a secret that feels more meaningful precisely because it is not being administered. They talked about the Marine who had not fired. This was the detail that caught and spread. Not the being itself, though they talked about that too. About the size of it and the sound of the drill and the way the orcs had run from something that did not run from anything. But the detail that moved the fastest, that passed between them with the particular velocity of information that contains a genuine surprise, was this. A space marine had stood in a corridor with a weapon. Something xenos had been in his range, and he had not fired. They did not have the vocabulary to analyze what that meant. They did not know about protocol or chapter doctrine or inquisitorial disclosure requirements. What they knew was that the biggest, most armored, most certain human they had ever seen had looked at the being in the helmet and had chosen silence. And that silence had a meaning, even if the meaning could not yet be named. From the dormitory, the information moved outward. Hive society is not sealed. The relocation level held not just the creche children but their families, connected by the dense social weave of people who have spent generations in the same sublevel, corridors, and who know each other's names and histories and the specific quality of each other's troubles. Parents asked their children what had happened. The children told them. The adults heard the story, and some of them set it aside, and some of them did not. The ones who did not were the ones who had already seen the symbol on the corridor walls in the weeks before the incursion. The ones who had already quietly filed away small personal experiences with the being in the helmet, a fixed bulkhead, a sealed hab door. A moment when the amber glow had appeared around a corner and then receded, leaving a space that felt safer than it had been before. The symbol began to appear again. This time the scratched lines were more confident and more deliberate, less the furtive instinct of a first expression and more the habit of a growing vocabulary. And beside it, in several locations, another marking appeared. It took investigators 2 weeks to recognize it for what it was. A crude aquila, not a proper one. Not the clean double-headed eagle rendered with the precision of reverence. A rougher version drawn from memory, simplified, approximate, but recognizable. The two symbols were placed next to each other, not overlapping, not in conflict. Side by side, the way two ideas can share a wall without canceling each other out. The whisper that carried them was simple. Even the Imperium could choose. The chapel chamber aboard the Iron Strider's command vessel was small by Astartes standards, which meant it was larger than most rooms that ordinary human beings would use for worship. The walls were hung with banners that listed battles going back 400 years, names that meant nothing to anyone still living except those who had been there. Names maintained not because anyone needed to be reminded, but because the Iron Striders, like most chapters, understood that memory was a form of armor. If you knew what you had survived, you could stand inside that knowledge when the present became difficult. You could reach for it. Aldrich. Vane stood in the chamber and did not reach for it. He was not a man who typically needed to stand in chapels. He was not, in the full and complicated sense of the word, a man given to the kind of introspection that resolves into doubt. 600 years of war does something specific to a being that begins with a human skeleton and is then redesigned from the inside out by surgical processes and the slow chemistry of an enhanced life. It does not necessarily remove the capacity for reflection, but it routes it differently. Reflection becomes tactical, a process by which past data is assessed for applicability to future situations. You do not sit with the weight of something you have done. You file it, extract the lesson, integrate it, and continue. But he could not file what he had seen. He had burned a world once, not by himself. One who starts with a flame unit does not burn a world alone. But he had been part of the mechanism, had stood on the surface of Fandrath II and done what the order specified, and the order had been correct by every measure he possessed for correctness. The world was compromised. The compromise could not be purged. The Imperium required the sacrifice and he had provided it, and when it was done he had logged the completion, and that was the end of the entry. A world and the end of it in a single line of text. He had done that and other things like it, and he had not stood in a chapel afterward. But he stood here now, in the quiet, with the banners and the candles and the particular dense silence of a room that has absorbed enough prayer to carry the habit of it in the air itself, and he turned what he had seen over in his mind with a care that was unusual for him, with a slowness that felt almost foreign. The being in the corridor, the placement of the body, the direction of the attention, the children. The drill roaring and then slowing, and then that final turn away from the Marines, which was not dismissal but something more like recognition. The recognition of someone who has already assessed a situation and determined that a particular variable does not require engagement. He was not troubled by the deletion of the footage. The decision had been correct, and he had made it cleanly, and he would make it again. That was not what the chapel was for tonight. What the chapel was for was this. He had spent his entire existence inside a framework that told him the categories. This is human. This is xenos. This is threat. This is acceptable. This is heresy. This is the Emperor's will. The framework was not tyranny. He did not experience it as a cage. It was, in the most genuine sense available to him, simply the structure of reality as he had learned to navigate it, the architecture inside which he was and acted and had meaning. And what he had seen in that corridor did not fit inside the architecture, not because it was threatening, not because it was corrupting, but because it fit inside the architecture's values and not inside its categories, and those two things were supposed to be identical, and they were not. The values said protect the innocent. The category said destroy the unknown. The being in the corridor had protected the innocent with a ferocity and a disregard for its own preservation that he would have respected without hesitation in a fellow Astartes. He would have written a commendation. He was not going to join the Guardian. This was not a conversion. He was not going to report him either. This was not rebellion. He was going to continue as captain of the Iron Striders in this sector, conducting the Emperor's war with the same competence and commitment he had always brought to it. He was going to file reports that did not contain certain information, and he was going to allow the gap between the values and the categories to exist inside him without trying to force it closed, because he suspected, with the instinct of 600 years, that forcing a closure would be the wrong thing to do. Some doors once opened are better left simply open, not walked through, just open. He blew out a candle. He walked back to the corridor. 3 levels above the command station on the upper lip of a collapsed transit hub that looked out over the hive midspire, Big Daddy stood in the dark and watched the Space Marine captain walk to the access hatch and descend through it and disappear. He had been watching for some time, not following. There is a distinction, and it matters, and it existed between them now even without acknowledgement. He had not approached, had not moved to intercept, had not done anything that could be read as an attempt at engagement. He had simply positioned himself at a high point, the way that beings of great situational awareness sometimes do, not from calculation but from the older instinct, to understand the space around you, to know where things are, to maintain the kind of awareness that is not paranoia but is its responsible ancestor. He had watched the squad return to the vessel. He had watched the captain enter alone and remain inside for a long period, and then emerge, and stand for a moment on the access ramp in the specific posture of someone who has done something irreversible and is checking the quality of the aftermath, the way you test the weight of a tool before you carry it a long distance. Then the captain had looked up, not directly at the transit hub, not at the collapsed lip where the amber light sat dim behind layers of smoke and shadow, but up into the general direction of the upper hive, into the dark spaces where the spires became too dense and too old for clear sight lines. It was not a scan. It was something more like an acknowledgement. The way you address a room when you know the room is not empty. Their eyes met, or the nearest equivalent of that, through the porthole lens, through the hive air and the distance and the smoke between them. There was a moment of mutual direction, attention meeting attention, awareness finding awareness, that lasted no more than a few seconds, and contained nothing aggressive, nothing challenging, nothing that in any honest reading amounted to a declaration. It was, in the specific language of that moment, something far simpler than any of those things. I know you are there. I know you know I am here. We have been in the same corridor. We have seen the same thing. Neither of us is pretending otherwise. Then Vane descended through the hatch. Big Daddy remained at the high point for a moment longer, not from indecision but from the patience of something that does not experience time as a pressure. He looked at the hatch. He looked at the city around him, the towers and the lights at varying heights and the smoke and the permanent industrial dusk of a world that has been building upward for so long that the ground is a memory and the sky is a theory. Then he turned and moved into the interior of the transit hub, stepping over debris with the careful precision of a creature that knows its own weight. He descended through a maintenance access. He moved deeper into the hive. He did not know about the report. He did not know what had been deleted. He walked through the dark and he did not know he had been defended, and the not knowing had its own kind of completeness. Valethorn did not open formal proceedings. That was the thing about him that people who thought they understood him consistently failed to anticipate. He never opened formal proceedings unless the case was already so complete that the proceedings were merely ceremony. What he did instead, what he had been doing for 34 years as a full inquisitor and 11 years before that as an interrogator in training, was move quietly into the architecture of the thing he was examining and begin to test its weight from the inside. He applied pressure at load-bearing points and he listened for the creak. He asked questions that contained other questions. He made requests that were technically routine and which, when granted and reviewed, revealed exactly the shape of what he had already suspected. He began with the chapter records. The Iron Striders maintained their operational logs on a standard chapter cipher with inquisitorial override access, which meant Thorn could view them without triggering an internal notification. This was a provision bitterly negotiated into the relationship between the Inquisition and the Adeptus Astartes 4 centuries ago, and which both sides technically honored while practically doing everything they could to minimize its utility. He did not request the full log. He requested only automated system data, power consumption records, ammunition counts, sensor check frequencies. The kind of request that looked like a routine maintenance audit and which nobody who was not specifically watching for it would parse as an investigation. The drill signature was in the power records. He had expected it. What he had not fully committed himself to expecting was the corroboration he found in a secondary sensor relay 2 levels above the corridor. A relay that had not been flagged as malfunctioning because whoever had managed the evidence in Subdistrict 14 Tertius had not known it existed. It was an old system, partially decommissioned, still occasionally recording as a matter of legacy habit. It had captured 12 seconds of audio. No image, the visual sensor had long since failed. Just 12 seconds of audio which, upon enhancement, revealed 2 distinct acoustic signatures. A sustained rotational mechanism at high rotations per minute, and impact sounds consistent with dense organic material meeting a high-speed drill. Consistent with everything. He filed the audio alongside the power consumption records in the camera timestamp anomaly and the imperfect details in Vane's report, and he looked at what he had built. It was not yet evidence suitable for a tribunal. An inquisitorial tribunal required a different quality of certainty, not reasonable doubt in the civilian sense, but the particular standard of institutional trust that required him to be prepared to defend his case against the scrutiny of his peers. He was not there yet, but he was close enough to know the direction. And the direction pointed towards something that troubled him more than the entity itself had. Somewhere in the Iron Striders chapter, a captain had made a unilateral decision to protect a xenos being from institutional visibility. That decision had been made by someone with 6 centuries of service and no prior deviation, which meant the deviation was not a pattern. It was a response to this specific entity. And if the being in the helmet could produce that response in a captain of the Adeptus Astartes, someone whose psychological resilience was meant to be the most structurally durable thing the Imperium produced, then what Thorn had been measuring in civilian populations was not the scale of the problem. It was only the surface of it. Civilian influence spread horizontally through community and fear and hope. This influence had moved vertically, through rank, through armor, through 600 years of conditioning that was supposed to make that kind of movement impossible. He initiated private audits of 3 additional Astartes operational logs from the past 6 months. He did not share these with his conclave. He did not send a Vox communication to Sector Command. He was patient. He was always patient. And something was about to require a different kind of patience entirely. Somewhere in the lower hive, a child picked up a piece of metal shard. It was the kind of shard that hive floors produce in abundance, a fragment of pipe casing or a strip of panel cover, long since separated from whatever it had once been part of and left behind by a floor that no one swept. The child held it in both hands and found a blank space on the wall of the relocation corridor, a clean section of plastiel between two dripping pipes, and began to scratch. The helmet first. Round, the suggestion of depth, the porthole marked by two careful concentric circles. The lines were uneven. The hands were small and the metal shard was not the right tool for the work. But the image that emerged was recognizable to anyone who had spent time in the lower hive in recent months. It had its own visual grammar by now. It did not need to be perfect to be understood. Then the child paused and scratched something else beside it. The Aquila is one of the oldest symbols in the human catalog, older than the Imperium by millennia, older than the moment someone first decided to carve it onto a banner and carry it into war. It is a bird of prey with two heads and spread wings, and it has meant empire and authority and the specific promise that order will be maintained, that someone above you in the hierarchy has a plan, that the structure will hold. It has been scratched by dying soldiers into bunker walls. It has been painted in gold onto the hulls of vessels going into void battles they were not expected to survive. It carries the full weight of 10,000 years of institutional faith, and most of the people who scratch it do not know any of that. They know only that it means something, that it is the symbol of the thing they are inside, the vast impersonal architecture that governs their ration amount and their hab assignment, and the level of the hive at which they are permitted to exist. The child scratched it imperfectly. The wings were uneven. One head was noticeably smaller than the other. The proportion suggested someone who had seen it on insignia and banners often enough to know its general shape, but who had never reproduced it until this moment, and who reproduced it now, not from theological conviction but from the specific emotional logic of a child who had witnessed something and needed to say these two things belong together. The helmet and the Aquila, not touching. Separated by a small gap of wall space that was, in its smallness, actually enormous. Not enmity, not union. The careful distance of things that are in relationship without having yet agreed on the terms of the relationship. The way two stars orbit each other without merging. The way a question can exist in the same sentence as an answer without being dissolved by it. In the weeks that followed, investigators working under Thorne's quiet audit found versions of this pairing in 14 separate locations across 3 sub-level districts. Not identical. Each pair drawn by different hands with different ratios and different levels of skill. Some placed the Aquila above the helmet, suggesting hierarchy. Some placed them side by side at equal height, suggesting companionship. One placed the helmet very large and the Aquila very small, and the investigators noted this in their reports with something that moved between clinical precision and considerable personal discomfort. None of the versions put them in opposition. And through the mid-spire and the deep dark of the infrastructure, through the pipes and the maintenance corridors and the quiet vast distances between one level and the next, a figure in an enormous armored suit moved alone, the drill at rest, the porthole glowing amber, walking the hive the way it had walked it for as long as anyone in the lower districts could clearly remember, which was long enough that the walking had become part of what the hive was, the same way the towers were part of it, and the smoke was part of it, and the constant grinding sound of 10 million lives in close proximity was part of it. He did not know about the symbols. He did not know about the Aquila beside the helmet. He did not know about the child with the metal shard. He walked through the dark, and the dark received him, and the symbol spread in his absence the way meaning always spreads, without the thing it refers to needing to know.